to say I'm delighted because when I'm speaking after the other presenters, I have to modify a little bit my introduction because what both Rajiv and David said about the necessity to understand religion in a broader sense in terms of non-exclusive system of belief is so relevant to the case of China. So that's the preface that your intervention really inspired. But unfortunately, I will have to say that the main point I want to make in this presentation is that, okay,
sorry,
I'm nervously watching. Okay, there we go. Yes, wonderful. Thank you. The main point I want to make is that unfortunately, China is not a model of regulation of religious diversity. And that relates to that particular point about exclusive definitions of reality. That being said, I want to add that China as a culture, as a civilization, has all the moorings that could make possible a very strong regime that supports religious diversity in a very expanded definition of the term of what constitutes a religion. And the reason I'm confident in saying this is if you look at a society which has all of the elements of Chinese culture, Taiwan, where the society and the state is moving in that direction of recognizing, celebrating religious diversity in a way that is not oppressive, in a way that is respectful of diversity in a deep sense. But I'm not here to talk about Taiwan. I'm here to talk about China. And the other thing I would like to add as a preface is that what I'm saying about the necessity that is felt in China to change the current status of regulation of religious affairs is a feeling that is shared very strongly by many of my colleagues in China. So many Chinese sociologists, anthropologists, historians over the years have expressed the necessity for government to change its approach to the regulation of religious affairs. So what I'm doing in my paper, and I will skip very fast on this because I want to emphasize the way in which religious diversity is managed in China so that you will see what are the difficulties, but also why it is unsustainable and why it is not working, and the challenges that the state is going to have to address. But I just want to say, I just want to dispel one impression that we have that China since 1949 has put in place a new mode of regulation. That is far from the truth. Because if we want to better understand the way in which the Chinese government is regulating religious affairs, we have to forget for the moment, my paper was talking about the contradictions of imperial and foreign legacies. But what really weighs much more than the foreign legacies is really the legacy, the institutional legacy of imperial control of religious affairs. Since the beginning of the Chinese state, religion has been very closely related to governance. John Lagerwey has written about China as a religious state. That is, that the very authority of the emperor rested on his control of religious life in China. So that means that the issue of religious diversity was an issue that was determined by the emperor and by the state that he has developed. State religion, therefore, was a mixture, a very complex system where the emperor was cautioning, was determining what is considered an acceptable religion. I spend on my paper on this issue, but I don't want to spend too much time because I want to address the contemporary issues. But the point is that even in imperial time, the state was already regulating religious affairs. And that became much more complex during the Yuan dynasty, that means when China was under the Mongols, and during the last empire, the Qing dynasty, when China became a truly multinational state. So on top of the system of regulation for religious affairs that the emperor already put in place, he also had to accept the structure of authority in the Tibetan religions, in Islam, in the part of the empire that had different religious traditions. So the Republican era was attempting to reproduce that system, but failed because the Republican regime never managed to control totally China. But during the emergence of the new regime in 1949, there were attempts to try to come to terms with that religious diversity, which was also having a national dimension, but also coming to terms with, of course, and that's where the foreign influence came in, the concepts of secularism. The concept of secularism was really adopted by many of the modernist reformers in China because they believed that traditional religion were responsible for the decline of China in the face of Western powers. So again, I don't want to expand too much on that, and just note that when we talk about this continuity between imperial times and today, you have to remember the period when Mao Zedong was in power. His authority over the country had in itself a religious dimension. And therefore, if you look at the celebration and the cult of personality that surrounded Mao, you really have the expression of the authority that was invested in the emperor. Of course, this was an anomaly because, of course, the Communist Party's own secular outlook was really uneasy with the cult of personality that developed around Mao. But the key point that is still valid today, is that when Chinese authorities, not Chinese scholars, important difference here, when Chinese authorities are talking about China as being a secular state, it is not about the liberal concept of a separation between state and religion. It's really about politics being above religion. And in that sense, there's a perpetuation of that imperial approach to religious diversity. What again is significant or remarkable is the solutions of continuity that you see in the way that the Chinese authorities have dealt with religion. What you have on your left side is an illustration, one of the propaganda posters that were describing the campaigns that the party launched against communal religions. That is, the religions practiced by a majority of the Chinese population in the countryside. And you see here how the communal leaders of religions in the countryside were despised as swindlers, as people who were abusing the population. And what you have on your right is, if you look at the picture and if you would read the text, you would see the similarities in the arguments that are made about, this time, not about communal religious leaders, but about members of Falun Gong, a religion that has been developed throughout the 1990s. So I will finish with this historical background, but just to emphasize now the current Chinese state predicament with respect to religion, which is this contradiction of, since the beginning of the Reform era, trying to develop what the Communist Party calls a spiritual civilization. So in other words, an attempt to recover some of the elements of traditional religions, thinking, philosophy, and at the same time try to achieve that with very, very rigid bonds, that is, defining what is an appropriate or not religion, or illegal or inappropriate religiosity. So what you have here is actually the temple of Jing'an, tranquil peace, which is in the middle of Shanghai, and that's quite illustrative of the way in which the state encourages the growth of religions, but within very strict parameters, to which I will now talk. The structure of control of religious affairs has four pillars. Four pillars that ensure that this structure of control is going to be able to control the evolution of religious affairs. So, at the apex, it's not the state, it's the Communist Party. You have to remember that in China, you don't have a regime of rule of law, where the constitution determines the limit of the actions that the political party can do. It's the reverse. The Communist Party in itself is determining what the constitution should do to enforce the directives and the worldview of the Communist Party. And the two most important elements of the Communist Party's regulation and management of religion is the United Front Department, which is an important organ within the Communist Party that is trying to communicate the directives of the party, educate the population, and also make sure that all of the other factors and actors within Chinese society are going to follow this directive. And I don't want to leave you with the impression that the Communist Party does that in a totally doctrinal way. And the interesting thing is that in recent years, the Communist Party is relying on an increasing frequency on the specialized knowledge of sociologists in the Central Party School, but also in an increasing number of think tank and research institutes that are informing the party about the status of religions. So the constitutional structure that is now imposed for the regulation of religious affairs is still a work in progress. The clear boundaries of what is admissible and permissible in terms of religious affairs is still unclear. And that's one of the main challenges that the party is facing. But the third pillar is the Bureau for Religious Affairs, which are led at the center by the State Administration of Religious Affairs, which is an organ of the government. So you see, this is not the state that is above political parties. That's a reverse relationship. Important to keep in mind, because the State Administration Affair can produce research, can do some form of supervision and monitoring, but cannot really force the hands of the Communist Party to change its policy. And the fourth pillar is actually the patriotic religious associations, the associations that are representing the religious believers or practitioners in China. There's 5 patriotic religious associations. For anyone who has studied Chinese history would realize quickly this does not make sense because of the enormous diversity of religions in China. Enormous diversity, again, if we take this definition of a non-exclusionary, a definition that really takes into account the various expression of Chinese religiosity in communal religions. So the 5 patriotic religions have all been established in the first years of the People's Republic from 1951 to 1956. Buddhist, Taoist, Islamic, Catholic, Protestant associations, that's it. I mean, if you're believing, if you follow the practices of Falun Gong, if you follow the practices of Iguan Dao and a host of other number organized, institutionalized religions, this is illegal. The role of the Patriotic Religious Association is to train and manage the affair of each of these 5 organizations. Now, what I'm going to show you now is the limitations of this form of control, which in itself is indicative of perhaps a major dysfunction within that whole structure that on paper is apparently very strict, very able to manage uniformly throughout the country the affairs of religion. I'm taking an example from the Buddhist Association of China, on which I've done research over the years and that I know better than the other ones. What you have here is the provincial branches of the Buddhist Association. And you would, for those of you who are familiar with the practice of religion in China, you know that Fujian has a very active activity among Buddhists. Same for the province of Anhui. Same for these 2 provinces, Shanxi and Jiangxi, and the province of Yunnan. You have lots of Buddhist activities, but you have no provincial associations. You wonder what is happening with the respect to the governance of Buddhist affairs. Now, if you look at prefectures and county association, you see, again, we are far from covering, in terms of institutions, uniformly throughout the country, the control of the affairs of Buddhist associations. I'll go very quickly just to emphasize again that there's no seem to be a correspondence. You have lots of county associations here, but you have no provincial association. That is indicative of either lack of uniformity about this policy or a problem with even putting their activities in proper registration. So the structure of governance for Buddhist affairs, and by extension to the other religions, is challenged by an imbalance between the different organs of government, the four pillars that I've mentioned before, that are not necessarily coordinating very well, and also by the pluralization of the religious field. So I'm going to go through them quickly, and so that's the lack of coordination between the different instruments, the different pillars. What you have here is temples that are not under the supervision of any of the county associations. So in other words, you have lots of Buddhist activities occurring, but you don't have any form of supervision. So although you have, in theory, a very tight supervision of religious activities, you don't have that being in a systematic way. And you find that about this lack of coordination, even when you take into account data that is collected by the Pauline Monastery in Hong Kong, which suggests that there are more county associations than the government itself would admit. Now, the pluralization of the religious field is now becoming more and more patent and obvious for the Chinese people. This is a Buddhist temple in central China, and if you go inside, what you see is a clear manifestation of a non-Buddhist practice. What you have here is three deities that are associated with Taoism, and itself, Taoism is a very, very controversial concept. This is again one of these constructions of the Communist Party to try to put together a wide variety of practices. So you have syncretism that is challenging a little bit this form of strict regulation. You also have a commodification of religion. You go to temples and you see people praying, and then you see people who are imitating the people who are doing the worship. So you have a very unclear, unsettled situation with respect to religious practices. Then, most important, you have also practices that are going way outside the official registration. So what you have here is a lay Buddhist lodge. This is not registered. Sometimes they are, but most of them are still being opened, and they are sites of some very interesting religious activities that are escaping the control of the state. What you have here is a virtual community of lay Buddhists that are listening to the predication of a monk living in Australia that is very, very popular in China today. And finally, I would say it's an increase in this pluralization, you do have now people who are presenting themselves as spiritual entrepreneurs. So Li Zhuming is someone who is selling massive quantity of books about new ways of living, about how to improve your moral health, how to improve your fortune, and he's selling also religious paraphernalia. But Li Zhuming is not a monk, he's just a lay, I cannot say Buddhist. He is someone who's having something very different that is not very dissimilar to what Liu Muzhe did for Falun Gong. But the authorities now tolerate that because they realize they just cannot control so rigidly, and they accept this kind of pluralization of the religious field as long as it's not seeming to present an organized and coordinated opposition to the regime. And one of the ways in which the regime now is trying to address this pluralization of the religious field is by now developing this idea of intangible heritage. The party is now struck with its very narrow definition of only 5 religions, but the explosion of religiosity in communal cults and the phenomena of religious entrepreneur is making it increasingly difficult for the government to legislate and to regulate. So it's, on the one hand, having a policy of laissez-faire, which is always making people unsure about the future of their practice, and at the same time instead of talking about the communal religions or about the popular religions as being superstition, now they are celebrated as a form of intangible heritage. So I'll leave you with the last slide, which is a propaganda poster that celebrated the policy of reform to show, if you look at this and the previous one, you'll see there's a family resemblance in the popular members of the celestial bureaucracy and the celebration of socialism.